This is TWiT.
We're talking a little bit about Google and how they're getting a little bit of in trouble on some of their data collection issues. Now, they're just not kind of having a good year. First, they were fined 4.3 billion euros or $5 billion for antitrust violations in the EU, which it had to do actually with them tying their search and their browser apps to the Android operating system. Now they're actually under fire because of their Google services on Android and iPhone store apps because of their location data. Even if you opt out of that location data, it seems like Google is still collecting your data. Now, in the app like Google Maps, it will remind you to actually allow access to your location data if you're using it for navigation. If you agree to let it record your location data, Google Maps will display the history for you in a timeline that maps out your daily movements. Now, in the lawsuit that was against Google by a Google user, Napoleon Pascals, feels Google is falsely representing themselves when privacy settings, even though they are still collecting data when you disable it. Now, the lawsuit seeks to represent all Google mobile users, both on Android devices and iPhones, and claims that the search giant violated privacy laws, including the California Invasion of Privacy Act and the right to privacy enshrined in the California Constitution. Now, this is not the first time Google was under scrutiny for location data practices. Back in November, it was recognized that Android users' location data being collected even when the location services setting was turned off. So first, I want to throw it to you guys. I think starting with Heather, data security, data integrity, privacy, these are all things that are kind of under a microscope the past several years. And this is just not the beginning of this. Are companies like Google being too cavalier with data like this? What do you think, Heather?
Well, I think that I made light of this story just last week, but that I think that privacy truly should be a priority. And if they're taking it lightly now, they probably need to rethink that. I'm somebody who picked up a stalker via Facebook years ago. And I had a good friend who started her own version of sleeping with the enemy by being cyberstalked by a spouse. So privacy issues are actually pretty serious. And you mentioned EFF.org earlier in the show, and I'm a big supporter of them. And I think that going forward, this is going to be something that we're not going to be scoffing at.
Right. What about you, Bam? I think, to me, it seems like companies are, they're saying, hey, we're gonna collect some data. It's not PII data, but it's just basic information. In this case, it's actually location information. Do you think that maybe Google here is being a little bit too cavalier with that data, that type of data?
I play devil's advocate here, right? I'm a big privacy advocate. I talk about using encryption, end-to-end encryption wherever possible, whenever you can. I think one of the things that we're seeing here is that any slight misstep or even perceived misstep is getting really put under a microscope, as you said. The question that I would have for Google is not whether or not they're collecting the location data, but how is that data stored, right? What's the context of the storage? And that's the thing that really is important to me. Are they storing just generic location data to see where the distribution of users is for Messenger or for their other services, and it's anonymized? I wouldn't have a problem with that, right? That probably helps them develop better classes of service, build a better network that makes my experience better. However, if they're storing that location data with my PII data, that's context, right? So we've got to kind of take a look, right? So they might be collecting that data, but is it being used in a way that's nefarious? Is it being stored in a way that it could be resold, or if it was compromised, could be really used in some evil way against me? Or is it just anonymous location data to say this is generically where users of a certain app are? And that's data that's probably very powerful for them to build better services. And then also the other data storage issue is to consider, is it long-term storage, or is it being collected and stored very ephemerally for 24 hours or even an hour or even a week or a month? Is it something that's just stored and it's just in this massive multi-petabyte Google data store of location information?
Right. Yeah, I think you kind of bring up a good point, because they do make profit off of some of this data by using it in some means. But the interesting thing is Google kind of make the major source of money, obviously, is ads, and they make it off of you using their search, and then obviously you jumping on their ads that are actually relevant to you. And sometimes location is a big piece of that puzzle. So Heather, what do you think? Is this something that we're going to see more and more from companies? I mean, obviously companies like Google need this data, especially data about you, so that they can make better decisions and more targeted decisions about you. Is this just something that we have to start regulating? Do you really, I guess the better question is, do you have a right to disappear? Do you have a right to turn that data off?
I like to think that I do. So yeah, I think that this is something that is, if they can monetize it, they will. And the question that I have for BAM is, if they are storing it long term without context, is there a way to contextualize it later on? I trust no one.
Right, that's a good question. What do you think, BAM?
So I think that's the question, right? It goes back to Snowden and talking about the PRISM program, not such a big deal. It's just metadata. The various NSA snooping that was going on. When they say just metadata to try to get us to kind of back off and leave them alone, that's a great question, right? Is it truly just metadata? What we found out later is the metadata that was being tracked by the NSA was anything but anonymized, right? It was very easy to figure out who, what, where, and when from that data, and that's why they were collecting it, of course. So we have a responsibility as citizens to hold these corporations, hold governments responsible for how they store our data, how they use it after the fact, and to demonstrate due diligence. Right. We talked about GPDR a couple of weeks ago, and it's a nice thing on paper, but I see it as largely unenforceable, as this particular incident kind of shows.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because with GDPR, obviously, customers are supposed to be able to control their data, but if there's no way to identify that data as being linked to you, there's no need for the corporations to make any use out of it, or delete it, or get rid of it, or even link it to you in any way. So that's an interesting take on that. I think one thing that's interesting, though, I wanted to bring up in this case is the fact that there's been multiple cases here where, even though you turn your location data off for this app, for these apps or services, they can somehow still collect it. So I'm not sure if that maybe be a case for the operating system or even the hardware companies that are maintaining these OSs that you can build these apps on. I mean, obviously they put these settings there for a reason. Somehow these apps are circumventing that. I don't know. I mean, what do you guys think? Is this something that we should that companies like Apple and Google, they should be paying attention to more, or maybe even looking in the code to make sure there's no way to circumvent that?
So that's a great point, and it really speaks to what's our recourse as citizens, right? We're relying on security researchers largely to tell us whether these companies are doing their job in terms of developing secure APIs, doing a good job of data storage. And we don't have answers. Most of us don't have answers, right? The three of us on this little informal chat here are a little more informed than most people, but I don't think any one of the three of us could really lay claim to being able to assert whether anyone's done their due diligence around the storage of our data. So that speaks to a whole other soapbox I could get up onto about the CFAA and how we prosecute so-called hackers versus security researchers, and where do you draw the line? And we don't really have good representation in government right now to establish the importance of a security researcher.
Right. Yeah,
well,
I think this is interesting. Go ahead, Heather. Yep.
Sorry, I was going to say we should definitely draw the line behind the guy that they arrested last year at DEF CON. But I think I can summarize everything that BAM so nicely said by quoting Stan Lee, with great power comes great responsibility.